like to welcome everyone to this afternoon session of the Media, Arts and Activism Symposium. Very pleased to be introducing you to our keynote speaker for the afternoon, who's Bonnie Jurek. But I will be handing over to my colleague and the curator of the Macquarie University Art Gallery in a minute to chair Bonnie's keynote. Just to explain and to start, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we're speaking on today and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Macquarie University is situated, which is the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continued to nurture this land since the dream time. We pay our respects to the Darug people and the Wallumattagal clan and to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people here today and acknowledge always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and that sovereignty has never been ceded in Australia. So the session goes for about 50 minutes for the keynote. We're going to keep people's mics on mute because we have quite a few people attending today. So if you have questions or comments and want to ask them of Bonnie when we get to the question and answer about just after past, about 25 to 3, then we'll read them out for you then. And we are recording the session today and we will share it on the YouTube of the Centre for Media History. So I'll hand over to Rhonda to introduce Bonnie.
Thanks, Justine. Well, welcome to this afternoon's session, which promises to be brilliant. I actually feel really honoured to be introducing the keynote speaker for this session, Bonnie Jurek. Bonnie is an acclaimed artist, activist, writer and historian. Bonnie is the author of 2 monographs on the Parramatta Female Factory Precinct, and she is the founder of Para Girls, a support group for former Parramatta Girls Home residents, and director of the Parramatta Female Factory Precinct Association. Bonnie is the author of Histories on the Hay Girls Institution, 14 Years of Hell, and Parramatta Girls Home, Abandon All Hope. Bonnie has realised many individual and collaborative creative works significant to the history of the precinct and Parramatta Girls Home. As an artist, she has produced new work for 6 major memory project exhibitions since 2013, tireless work. Her advocacy on behalf of Para Girls and other forgotten Australians has been acknowledged in both state and federal parliaments. She is the recipient of a National Volunteer Award 2011, as well as the Parramatta Heritage Advocacy Award in 2013. Also Parramatta Australia Day Award in 2017. Bonnie is adjunct lecturer at University of New South Wales Art and Design, and she is member of the Order of Australia. On a personal note, I have great admiration and gratitude for Bonnie Jurek. My late half-sister was a forgotten Australian. Wrongly institutionalised at Carlingford Girls Home, she spent the best part of 10 years subjected to domestic servitude and robbed of the education she wished and deserved. Sorry. Bonnie's courageous moral and intellectual work has given a voice to those subjected to such fate like my sister. Thank you so much, Bonnie. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you. Well, thank you for, I welcome everybody, and I do hope that you find what I'm presenting informative, and I'd certainly encourage everyone to have some questions, which I'd love to answer at the end. Today, I'd like to share with you a bit about my journey, the influence of others I've met along the way, and how the Memory Project has harnessed art and activism to raise awareness about the history, heritage and legacy of the Parramatta Female Factory Institutions Precinct. Let's start. At 15, all I wanted to do was study art at the National Art School. Back then, it was East Sydney Tech College, and by the time I eventually got there, the name had changed. It took many years to finally realise this dream. I finally arrived at the National Art School in 2002. I knew this place had another history, a history of incarceration, of confinement, of punishment. Because of my own experiences, it was familiar, but not personal. I could read this place like no other. The sandstone, the cells, and the graffiti scratched into the walls. All of this awoke a deep sense of injustice buried long ago and brought about a radical change in myself and in my approach to art making, and a realisation that I could harness the power of art to make change. Meanwhile, the Australian Senate Standing Committee were conducting an inquiry on Australians who experienced institutional or out-of-home care as children. Released in 2004 as the Forgotten Australians report, the committee found that upwards and possibly more than 500,000 Australians experienced care in an orphanage, home or other form of out-of-home care during the last century. I was one of those Australians.
Sorry, Bonnie. We're just wondering if we can't see your slide, so we're just wondering if you could click from current slide or resume, maybe.
Your screen sharing is paused. I don't know why that is paused. Oh. Okay, all right, I'll try that again.
Thanks.
Here it is. Share. Now, I don't know whether you might have missed two earlier screens.
Yes, I think we did.
Okay, all right. Well, there's the first one. This is the work I did. I started to do at the National Art School. So you can see here these sort of images and the graffiti and the cells, this whole memory and experience of the institution started coming forward, and I started to play around with these ideas in my art making. Right, okay. Now this here, this is the Australian, this was the Australian Senate Standing Committee on Forgotten Australians, and this image here is on the right. There's a bunch of Parramatta girls outside the Parramatta girls' home. It's 6 o'clock in the morning for our journey down to Canberra for the apology to the Forgotten Australians. And you'll see the photograph at the bottom there is in the Great Hall where the apology was given. Right. In the following year, that's in 2005, I co-curated the Forgotten Australians exhibition at the New South Wales Parliament House. This exhibition represented the first attempt of people from this background to explore their history, the effects of their childhood on their lives, and to share this with outsiders in the form of art. Many people from the care background have shown works in exhibitions previously, and these have always been framed by others, usually welfare providers or government agencies, and used to propagandise and advertise the good works of their services through the words or eyes of the client. This was the first time that care leaders had put on a show for themselves. Here is an eclectic mix of works created by a diverse mix of individuals, many of whom have never done art, who came together with such resonance and passion that few can fail to be moved by the raw emotions expressed and the cruelty exposed. This exhibition was disturbing. A point driven home when a number of works were removed from display in the New South Wales Parliament because children might be offended by them. Sadly, those works, like others in the exhibition, explored and gave voice to the very real misery and brutality that was inflicted on children once under the direct care of the Parliament. It seems ironic that they should have been censored for the benefit of children who live in a society increasingly filled with gratuitous violence marketed as entertainment. It was the heartfelt desire of all that these works would confront and inspire and help explain what happened to the forgotten Australians and continues to happen to children in care to this day. Encouraged by this, I felt the time had come to explore more of my own experiences, to share with others the deep forgotten history of the institutions of the Parramatta Female Factory Precinct. Emboldened by this, I climbed over the iron palisade fence of the deserted Norma Parker Women's Detention Centre with video camera in hand to document a place for which me and thousands of others will always be Parramatta Girls' Home. Piercing both time and memory, I entered the main building through an open window. It was a bold action, the consequences of which I could have never anticipated. Camera rolling, I made my way through the deserted building. Relying on memory to navigate the site, I made my way to the second floor where the dormitory I spent 8 months in was located. It was confusing and confronting, but necessary in my search for answers. There, at the end of the room, was a mural of a small girl looking out across the sandstone wall. I suppose it had been painted by someone who had been there when occupied as the Norma Parker Women's Prison. It made me think about earlier times when the institution was an orphanage. Was this a child looking for her mother over the wall in the adjacent female factory? I got to thinking about all the children who passed through this institution. Who were they and what became of them? This thought stayed with me to take form in the Children's Day event staged in 2014. Now here is the video that I recorded on that first visit into the institution. It's not, I don't think it's terribly long. How long is it? Well, it's 10 minutes. I just might play half of it now, but it will give you a sense of the camera shake because I was so nervous and terrified and completely disorientated. But it's there's a lot of black screen. It's really about, it really gives you a sense of actually what it looked like when I entered it. So it was darkness and confusion and uncertainty. So I'll just play this now.
Girls used to talk about dungeons under the walkway. Guess where we're standing?
In a dungeon.
And we're under the walkway.
We are too.
This is the main corridor under the main building. That must be where the front entrance is. Would that be right?
No. Because the next one over takes you into the showers. That goes straight through into
No, this
the
have
showers.
to be. No, this would have to be the main. This would have to be the main corridor of the original gym building.
Okay.
Because the gym building would have gone to that wall, and in here, as far as not that we can see. Steps there.
look what I found. Oh, boys. So the girls have been down here, and this is the dungeon that they talked about, that probably thousands of girls knew about anyway, but no one was going to talk. We were silenced. So we've got here, Send My Love Forever. You probably see a name there.
Yes. There's a name. There's a name here. RM.
Till I Die. I love, worship and adore you.
There's
always.
That looks like a date. 78. What's it? Is that a wall? What is that in front of us?
What was it?
It's a wall
There
of
we are.
some kind.
It is a wall.
And here on this side, the left side, what's on there?
Oh, it looks like the original colours. Look at it, it's beautiful. More writing, so they've gone right over into there.
Right. There's lots of writing here. Lots of writing.
I'll stand there. Yep. Come on.
Okay.
Wow, that's a find, isn't it?
If it's
All the
there,
way.
it'll be in these other rooms. It'll be in these other rooms as well, carved in the wall. And we just can't see it.
And this has all been scrubbed.
Yep. It'll be in there too. We just can't see it. There's, looks like writing just here to me.
Okay, here's this. What this is. In there.
Right.
That looks like another door.
It does
It
too.
is.
The light on the phone.
And there's a window here.
Oh dear. Oh, there's the wall, I can feel it, and there's an alcove. There's a slope. There's a grate. Look at that. Look up here. Oh, and what's over here? Oh, God.
That's the only ventilation in here.
God, imagine being locked in here.
Ah,
Look, there's writing. Is that writing?
yep. Yep.
Oh, there's a lot of it.
This much is
64. 64. Is that right here? 64. 64.
Okay. Take a pee away.
Oh, gosh. There'll be stuff here.
Here's the right thing, yeah. Yeah, and it's even engraved by Rose.
Oh,
I love
there was a rose here when I was here. Rose, a little Aboriginal girl,
Sounds.
and they sent her to Hay.
Now, what's that? Is that dead eye?
Yeah, it does look like that, and there's a name here.
Jetty.
Brown. Is it Brown or something like that? What's on this side? Look, there's. See that?
Yep, got it.
This is one of the rooms. Hang on. Let me put this off. I love worship and 1963, 1962. Maz.
See, the others didn't get a chance because I couldn't get in here, and they were freaking anyway.
Oh gosh, look at all of this. Sue. She's got 1990 written there. Someone's been back. 152, loves 39.
Hey? Something new. Could be a mood. Don't freak me.
Look at what's doing on the wood.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I hope I haven't frightened everybody too much. And that's whenever I watch that, I'm back there at that moment and experiencing all those emotions. So it's very, very confronting for me. And really, it's the first entry into the mystery and the silence of that institution. Really, this precinct, this institutional precinct, was a sleeping fortress whose memories and secrets needed to be reawakened. It needed to move from passive forgetting to active remembering, from silence to speaking out, and from running away to standing ground. It was time to break the silence. This view that we're looking at now is the front veranda of the main building, and it looks over to the superintendent's house, cottage, which was located in the front yard, which has now been demolished. And where that used to stand is a memorial, which hasn't yet been unveiled, funded by the state government in recognition of the abuse that occurred within that institution. We hope to have that unveiling in maybe February or March next year, but it's taken 5 years. So anyway, hopefully it will happen. This institutional precinct is a place where thousands of vulnerable women and children were confined to the care of the state. Its history had been obscured by the lens of state propaganda and dampened by time. And as I delved into its history, I discovered that it was first built as an orphanage for Catholic children, and that it was located next to Australia's first convict female factory. I soon realised that this site was ground zero in the long narrative of child welfare in Australia. With plans afoot for the redevelopment of this state-owned site and the decommissioning of the Norma Parker Centre in 2012, I took the opportunity to act on a recommendation made by the Forgotten Australians report for the memorialisation of this former child welfare institution. Ill-equipped to take on this task alone, I came across another artist who had ventured into the dark space of the institution through her artistic practice. Her name is Lily Hibbard. Unlike me, Lily had not experienced institutional care as a young person. Her interest in confinement was prompted by her discovery of the raised site of the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum, once the most prominent building in North Melbourne where she lived, which had been demolished in 1912. Like me, she was unsettled by dark tourism that suggests harsh treatments border on fiction. In her work, Benevolent Asylum, she speaks to this as simply another radical forgetting, that confinement operates in precisely the same way in asylums, prisons and detention centres today, and that solitary confinement is a prevailing public secret of Australian punishment. In scrutinising both the history of institutional confinement and the relationship between historical research and creativity, Lily sought to imagine history as an active and shared practice that belongs to the whole community. But how can this be achieved? How can we, as a community, deal with tourism and historical forgetting, questions of preservation or participation at significant sites, and the continuation of covert practices like solitary confinement and forced detention? These were the questions that brought us together in 2011, and in 2013 we launched the Memory Project. Our aim was to bring together artists, academics, historians and former occupants to activate this historic precinct as Australia's first site of conscience, so that its history, heritage and legacy would not be forgotten. In the same year, then Prime Minister Julia Gillard announced a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Fortuitously, this brought more attention to the site, and with that came the return of other Parramatta girls who, like me, sought answers. From the outset, Paragirls have been at the heart of what we do. The Memory Project has called for a multifaceted approach in the recording of oral histories through research and archiving, in the production of artworks, in the staging of exhibitions and events, lobbying politicians, and in contributing to the dialogue on why and how this site should be preserved and utilised into the future. Inspired by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience principle, Memory to Action, the Memory Project has given Paragirls agency to tell their own stories, to interpret their experiences, to determine how they want to be remembered and how the site may be used in the future. This is a work that we produced in partnership or collaboration with the National Institute of Experimental Art at the University of New South Wales in 2017. It's called Paragirls Past Present. And it was extraordinary 3D work that was first screened at the Epi Centre at the university in 2017 as part of the Big Anxiety Festival. I'll just play this. It's only a few minutes, quickly.
They won by putting me in here, but they didn't beat me.
No.
Okay, they were the winners. They got to shut the door. But I'm standing here and it hasn't beaten me.
wonder sometimes, you know, whether the coverway signifies something or stands for something else, you know, between a past and a present.
And I knew it was sort of trouble, but many a time I couldn't help myself. I used to say, "What are you looking at?" And I couldn't help myself because you knew what they were looking at. Because not only did you have to watch out for the male predators, you also had to be careful of the female predators.
Girls who were put up in the loft to scrub, they would stand in one spot with a bucket and a scrubbing brush, and they would scrub for 15 minutes the rafter above their head, and then scrub 15 minutes of a patch, a square, a foot in front of them, and then up again. This would go on all day for them, and days after days as a punishment. I don't think you can walk through this place without hearing scrubbing.
We never knew that was the significant part of the wall for me, was that bit, because over here we had isolation that hid a lot of the wall. So when you come past there, you see that wall, and many of us used to wonder, because we always thought of escaping, but we didn't know what was on the other side of the wall.
Now, you can see from the beginning to this point and through the years, thousands and thousands of people have come through the site. And these are just some images of some of the events and activities that we've had on site. As in the words of Maria Tamarkin, the Memory Project has taken people from isolation to community, from silence to voice, from social invisibility to cultural legitimacy, from looking away to looking at, from neglect to vitality, from victim to witness, from safely in the past to powerfully and palpably present. This brings me to the conclusion of my presentation, and I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the folks at Macquarie Uni who've been terrific over the years in organising this symposium. Thank you. Bye. Right.
Oh, Bonnie, I had to leave then. I was so emotionally, yes, it was very emotional, that last film. You amazing, and there's a lot to be said and done. I was very interested in the way that you said that first entry into the mystery of going back into the place, the site. It's a reawakening the silence to speaking out. And I guess that's part of the healing process. And also being an artist, I think that sort of quickens the process in a sense. And I was very interested in the way you said a lot of the women had never done art making before, but those expressions came out, you know, raw emotions from the experiences that the girls had felt.
Yes, yes. And there's a lot to be said when you get you know, a collective of people together. You know, you've got your creatives and your stakeholders and others, you know, researchers, and you bring them together and you have conversations and cups of tea and so forth, and a bit of laughter and a bit of fun and a couple of cuddles and all that, and wonderful things happen. And it's interesting, as I was just thinking about that first visit in, you know, into the darkness, and finding all those names on the wall, and it really just then again the penny dropped, because very soon after, a few years after that, of course, we got the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and during that process, it went on for a few years. I had a lot of contact with detectives who were doing the investigations into allegations, and I would meet with them very regularly, you know, numerous times a year, you know, because they saw me, because I, one, had not put a claim in for any sexual allegations, so in that way I wasn't tainted in a way, you know, I didn't have a bias particularly, and two, because I had gone through that place and I documented everything, because I'd gone down into those dungeons and into other places, and I found those names on the walls and the dates and all of that. And so when they took evidence from women who said, I was locked in that room in this year, and when I was locked in, I scratched my name in the wall, and you'll see it, you'll find it up there above the doorway and blah, in this position. So I was able to take those detectives into those locations and find those places, and that became evidence for later criminal prosecutions. So there you are, you know, and now all of that graffiti, all of that area has all been boarded up by the government, and it's very fragile. I worry about it. I worry about the loss that's going on and the secrecy that continues, but at least it's been documented. So I just wanted to add that point about how absolutely necessary it is to bear witness, to be brave, to jump over fences and to speak up.
Yes, yes, Bonnie. You were certainly courageous. You're amazing. Look, I'd like to open it up to everyone and for discussion or comments or questions of Bonnie. Do you want to raise your hand, or just unmute? And is there anyone out there? Can't see, or do it on the chat if that's easier. Not yet. No. The other thing, Bonnie, that I was interested in is that intersection between tourism and significant sites. Did you want to sort of comment further on that? Is there?
Yes, I do. One of the things I want to say is, again, when I started off, nobody knew about, I actually named that site the Parramatta Female Factory Precinct. I came up with that name. It was just not known at all. It's known as Norma Parker Centre and Cumberland Hospital. So it needed a name, very important to, you know, to locate and position it. And secondly, there's been, there was just nothing known. And so I did all the research and I put up a website and started sharing the information and so forth. And of course, it captured the interest of people who are descended from convicts and the general public, because, you know, most Australians who've gone through the school system have an awareness of our convict history. And, you know, that's, people are very enthusiastic to embrace convict history and think, oh, that's great, tourism, blah, blah, blah. But they completely ignore the fact that we've had this 150-year history of basically child abuse that we want to look away from still. And so one of the things that happens is that I'm constantly up against this battle between this sort of populist history of convictism, you know, and those and children. And I remember very early in the piece when I was trying to get some help and support and interest, because I wasn't anyway a historian, I guess I've become one, but I tried to get some professionals to help me with that, and I'd sort them out. And I was told that they were not interested in the dirty history of Parramatta. They were only interested in the convict history. You know, you can just imagine how I felt. So there's this big trend, and it's been established by, you know, places like Port Arthur and Fremantle Prison and Cascades in Female Factory, all of these places, you know, where there's this expectation of a particular type of tourism. And the trouble with it is it presents people as, you know, as entertainment. And I can tell you, the thing that really irritated me is that, and every other Parramatta girl and every other forgotten Australian who was in an institution, we are not there for people's entertainment. We are bearing witness to a history unspoken. And we do not want to be depicted and used in a way that presents us that way. And this is one of the battles that I have currently with Property New South Wales, who I must say, some people within that organ are very sympathetic and others simply have no clue. So yes, because it's coming up to a point where early next year, they'll start opening up some of the precinct buildings and doing interpretation signage and digital displays and so forth. And I worry, and I have told them that no Parramatta girl will agree to be entertainment for anybody. We are not there for that. But this site must be used for what it can do. Use its history for what it can do to change things now and in the future, not just to look back. We don't want to look back. We've had enough. Yep.
You've gone through enough, the forgotten Australians. They endured sorrow and pain for a long time. And yes, that's so correct, Bonnie. And I hope you sort of get to the places that we need to go, and those sites are very important for educational purposes too, that we need to know these histories, these forgotten hidden histories that are difficult to talk about, but you know, it's got to be put out there, and that's part of the process that makes the healing happen, I guess.
Well, it's not just about healing, it's about change. And yeah, and because you have to actually say who, you know, in the future, 20 years or 30 years or 50 years or 100 years, people go to those sites and they'll have questions and they'll want to know things. And let's, while we can, do the best to share you know, what it was like, because we do not have one record, one recording, one image, or even a dress of one convict woman. We've got nothing. The silence of all those women who went through that earlier institution, and the silence of all those children who went through the orphanage before us. That's what we contend with. And, you know, that's a great tragedy, but at least these days we're able to to be heard and you know, make something for the future. So we're not constructed a particular way.
Bonnie, we do have a question here from Nicole Matthews. Bonnie, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Can you say something about how art might move people who are not survivors or forgotten Australians beyond this frame of entertainment?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know how. I mean, you know, that's a very individual, you know, subjective thing. How, you know, art can move people. It's very subjective. I can't determine how people will respond to a work. I guess the thing is that, you know, we have such an array of media and forms these days that we can at least attempt to present as much of a like 360-degree view, if you like, into something that we could never do with like a static image, if you like, or whatever. Yeah, it's really one of the things, it's the power of storytelling, I think, that really, and if that's in a work, that storytelling, whether it's just a two-dimensional work or, you know, moving or whatever, it's that connects, I think. And that's where maybe the power lies, in that story and that human connection. Yep.
Thanks, Bonnie. Are there any other questions or comments? What time do we need to wrap up, Justine?
In a minute. So I think we could have one more question if anybody had a question they wanted to ask.
Can I, while someone's coming up with a question, I'll just add.
Juno.
Have we got one?
And Bonnie,
Yes,
if you wanted to
Juno's.
say something, please go ahead, Bonnie.
Yes. Like in this last year, it's just given me a moment to actually look into my own sort of ancestry as well, which is, you know, there we are. You know, in your own family, you get stories told to you about, you know, great aunt this and that, and usually, you know, if you're a kid or, you know, think just not listening to that mum, you know, like these are all dead rallies who, you know, guess sort of thing. Anyway, as it turned out, I thought, oh, look, I should actually probably delve in, because I'd heard about, you know, artists in my families and scientists and things like that, and, you know, they're all very distant in 100 years ago sort of thing. But I found out that one of my ancestors, and I just wonder about, you know, how things come around. One of my ancestors was Australia's first anthropologist. His name was Robert Hamilton Matthews, and he was responsible for documenting the Darug languages and many languages of Eastern Australia. He was a surveyor, and he's buried actually at Maze Hill Cemetery in Parramatta, which I didn't know, I only found out recently. And he was actually buried on like the 22nd of May, which is actually my birthday, like 40 years before I was born or whatever, you know, but which is weird again. But it just makes me think, because I started sharing that with like many of my sort of Aboriginal girlfriends and that, and Darug women, that sort of thing. And I said, oh, do you happen to know this bloke? You know, oh, we know him. We've heard his name before. You know, he's responsible for this. And I said, well, I didn't know that, you know. So it's almost like unfinished business, you know, if you sort of believe in, you know, either like reincarnation or, you know, like carrying on in a family in a way, you know. It's like I'm doing that next stage of the work, you know.
Bonnie, we've got a few coming in at the moment. We've got Juno that wants to say something,
Okay.
a dear friend and colleague, Juno Gems. And I'll just also say from Duncan, his microphone isn't working at the moment, but just wanted to say that it was a necessarily harrowing but excellent presentation. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Juno, good to see you.
Hi. I'm sorry I came late to this, but it was most powerful what I saw. And Bonnie, I just want to ask you because we're facing a similar situation trying to save Pete Island at the moment, which
Yes.
has a similar history.
Yeah.
And we want the history acknowledged. And were you responsible for dealing with Figgy New South Wales, whatever is Property New South Wales, to have the factory opened up as a space that people could enter?
This is my advice. A possession is 9/10 of the law. If you can get a room or something, a shed on Pete Island, you can begin. Whilst you're always outside, it's next to impossible. So, and I know I spoke to some guy who was part of the Pete Island group or advisor or something, and I suggested that to him. But yeah, yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bonnie. That is really, we're thinking of something like that, because the buildings actually are quite good, making an artist residency or something like that, so we could invite people onto the site, right?
Yes, that's the way to go. Yes,
That's brilliant advice. Thank you.
If you have to camp.
Create a camp. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Juno. We've got one more. Have we got time, Justine?
Probably not, because I can see people setting up. I can see people from the next panel. Unfortunately not. I can see the question. It's a great question, but
it is a great question.
I have to leave
Can
it.
I put this to you, Bonnie? I'd like to hear more about what is meant by using these spaces to do something for survivors rather than just entertainment history about them.
Right. Well, the most important thing is acknowledging the people who went through these places and experienced it. It's people that animate place, not place animate people. So without the people, it's meaningless. It's just architecture. Yeah, so I'm probably not answering that properly. Anyway, that's the best I can do for the moment. So.
Thanks, Bonnie. It was just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Could sit here all afternoon, couldn't we? Yeah.
So
do I go off now, Justine?
we'll just give Bonnie another round of thanks, and people have posted in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. Brilliant.
Hey.
So we're now just having a quick 5-minute break.
Welcome, friends. My name is Alex Etling. You've joined us for the final panel of Lines of Resistance, a symposium on media arts and activism, and we are discussing the question, what can the old left offer today's creators? As our gathering is online and people are joining us today from all around Australia, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay respects to all the elders. This land was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Ideally, we'd be including much more about the experience of First Nations resistance in a talk like this, especially the communications used in the early years of the Frontier Wars. But that depth of knowledge is largely lost to us because of the brutal dispossession and the colonial project, which was conscious of separating people from their culture and history. Erasure from stories, that is something that the cultural tradition of the First Nations shares with the traditions of the organised working class. Being ignored is bad enough, but also the frustration of having really thoughtful and complex cultural practices being reduced to naive misunderstanding of what they're about. Both these cultures engage with profound ideas around storytelling, belonging, and the blurred boundaries of performance and spectacle. For anyone who thinks that dots are just dots or banners are just bits of cloth to paint on, there's a world of discovery for you about how phantasmagorical and bending of space and time these objects are. We've posed the question today, what can the old left offer today's creatives? There's been about 4 new lefts, so there's probably been about as many old lefts, but really what it means by the label is the politics where there is some sort of engagement around relationships at work and economic power. So what the old left can offer, first of all, is some guidance to strategy, an assessment of power dynamics, of what levers are most effective to push. If we think about this strategy, it guides us towards how important it is to have grassroots participation, collective action, activity that nurtures experience and has a strength. One strategy that is very connected to the old left is following the money. So putting a stop to the flow of profits is a well-proven tactic to get what you want. They have money and we have the numbers. Activists of the left have the potential to harness significant numbers around economic action that can be transformative to the whole of society. It's an immense amount of potential power, but that's all it is. It's potential. Learning about your strength and gaining the confidence to be active, that's something that creatives can play a role in. There's nearly always potential to draw upon the creative skills of people around you, and the history of the left quite often leaves behind a legacy of visual ephemera from these struggles. Our speakers will all show examples of that today. But first, to set the scene, I'm going to go over some history of Australia type stuff, because it will become clear that creativity and resistance has been pretty bound up with Australian political economy. So the Australian colony starts off as a military settlement, effectively a military dictatorship. The people at the bottom of the food chain are not always happy with their leaders, and so we have here one of the first recorded pieces of Australian political art by an unknown artist, which is Governor Bligh getting pantsed, so it's a good start. Australia's place in the global economy was mostly about extractive industries, shipping wool back to British markets. But when gold was discovered, that changes things. There's now enough money sloshing around locally to develop industry, cities grow up, and significantly there's now an urban working class who are being exploited to make profits. When people are worked hard and they're receiving all they're entitled to, they're not receiving all they're entitled to, there's a potential for them to resist that situation. So we get the first trade unions, and a union is a self-defense organisation for workers in capitalism. If you're separate, you're weak. If you're together, you can press for demands in a stronger position. The creativity of the working class at this time can be found in radical songs, jokes that mock the powerful, and all the secretive ways that people began to organise themselves when unions were illegal. The earliest accounts of collective action from workers in Australia are seafarers. The ephemera of these very early organising efforts haven't survived, but there may be newspapers and books being exchanged. It's likely that an oral culture was particularly strong, exchanging news from other sailors in ports around the world about how they've been able to press for better conditions, learning about the value of solidarity to support each other's campaigns. But in the old days, people would go down to the wharves or the park and there would be a speaker's corner. In this world, changing the channel is just walking along to the next person on their soapbox. People would make opportunities to come together around drinking at the pub or going to the gym or going to reading rooms or adult education centres, anything to talk about politics together. Now, agitators would go by train around the country to spread their message and to get meetings happening, set up branches, become part of the network of newspaper distribution, and that was quite common amongst anyone who wanted to spread their ideas, whether it was religious missionaries or New Age gurus. You see these massive processions around big artworks, floats and banners reclaiming the streets away from commerce, workers taking over the city, celebrating their status as the people who do all the work that makes society tick. Now, in the early days, carnival was really important, whether it was a demand for a shorter working day or around the international workers' holiday of May Day. The boundary between who is marching and who is viewing blurs, and there's songs and chants, performances, literature being given out, so it's a multimedia extravaganza. Now, the reductive way of looking at the early Australian art after colonisation, the formal art world, most of it was about land and the relationships that people had to land. And because oil paintings were expensive, nearly all of it was about rich people and their status of owning lots of land in Australia. Occasionally you get some people jousting with that in a minor way, like a Tom Roberts who shows labourers shearing sheep or something. or an S.T. Gill painting the real life of workers' communities. So that's about respecting working class people, but in general, art is about being fancy and purposefully intimidating ordinary people. Now, there is an element of visual culture around working class activity, though. People also sell small prints, particularly of like martyrs, like the Victorian Socialist Party did when Tom Mann was imprisoned, and things like playing cards with political satire or pictures on the back, sometimes even coins with political messages on them, small trinket type things that would travel quite easily. And the print culture really develops in Australia after the 1850s. And there are actually a lot of progressive newspapers, but it's also very laborious to make them, and most of them don't have many graphics. So you can see that the art world and radical politics are largely separate. The bohemian pubs and cafes were the two sensibilities. That's where the two sensibilities mix a bit, and that was productive to an extent, just because that's a place where people can talk about things away from repression. So people like Henry Lawson, P.R. Inky Stevenson, Jack Lindsay, Guido Baracci, these are worth exploring to get a sense of that dynamic, but you can go off in wildly different directions, which you will see if you Google any of those people. And often it was really just a pathway to drinking more, not inspired activism or any great art. So realism was really always the dominant form of expression. There doesn't really seem to be much interest in exploring aesthetics within political action, not until the 1930s. But what these early bohemian communities did sometimes do was promote unionism and promote the dignity of working class people who they rubbed shoulders with in these urban areas. Now, the Australian labour movement excelled in cartooning, and this was an important tradition of very immediate art, and the IWW harnessed that potential well and really changed the whole dynamic of the Australian labour movement when they took off in 1907. And Ian McIntyre will tell us more about the IWW in his presentation. In Australia, with the distances, there's such a delay in debates around modernism in visual art, it misses being conjoined to that revolutionary wave that emerges out of World War II into the mid-1920s in Europe. But then Australia's communist movement had a slightly longer period of vitality too. But when the 30s comes along and you've got the political economy of the Great Depression, the Communist Party has the militant minority movement, and is engaging in grassroots politics in the workplace and the community with anti-eviction politics. So you have an interesting flourishing of radical art happening alongside direct action style political activity. And the socialist publication, New Masses, and people like Mike Gold and the John Reed clubs, these American left-wing ideas out of New York, they're now accessible in Australia and influencing the modernism that starts to come in throughout the 1930s. The journey of modernism in Europe goes through some really interesting art movements, which all have a left and a right dueling with each other. So Romanticism, Expressionism, Dada, Futurism, Constructivism, Productivism, Surrealism. Australia sort of skips over all of that and just reading about it rather than participating in it. But then through magazines like the Australian Strife and Stream and Proletariat and Masses, you can see that radical art that develops here in Australia has sort of a proletariat bohemianism. That's the spin in Australia. And it's apart from institutions, so it serves as a form of institutional critique. And it's about breaking from formalism and being super concerned about how pictures look in their picture frames, and is more about what the social role of art is. So in the early 1930s, the first workers' art clubs are established in cities around the country. There's worker art exhibitions and radical plays. It's early days, and these people are feeling out a way of combining art and radical left-wing politics. It's still a bit of a niche bohemian type thing, but it's important that they're not being snobby, that there's an art movement that wants to push out to reach ordinary people. So in Lisa Milner's presentation, she'll take us through where those communists go in the next period, with the realist film units and new theatre and things like that. Now, at the end of the 30s into the 40s, you have the mainstream of both the art and the politics scenes really debating out the questions of art and social change. You have people like Bernard Smith, John Reed, the Australian one, Max Harris, Albert Tucker, Noel Counihan, all identifying as one sort or another of anti-capitalist and debating publicly as leading figures in art. So, setting aside the actual views that these people had, what I think is appealing for us today is that potential for workers' movement, for the workers' movement when it was taking a leading role in organising resistance to austerity, for it to shift the terrain of the debate leftwards in the most elite areas of Australian cultural life. It came from the very real possibility of systemic change. People had to take revolutionary ideas seriously. It wasn't intellectuals providing that steam for movement, it was masses of ordinary people. What were the questions that people were asking? Things like how art fits into daily life, the role of artists, what makes good art. Some of the questions had been raised going back to the Renaissance and further back into antiquity, but in the 20th century, after that revolutionary wave in the interwar years, we have key left-wing thinkers leading some of these debates about culture and politics, and especially thinking about the role of the organised working class. Walter Benjamin, Bertolt Brecht, André Breton, Leon Trotsky, Diego Rivera, George Lukács, Guy Debord, Herbert Marcuse, people like this. And in the second half of the 20th century, Australian cultural radicalism is now much more closely in dialogue with these intellectual currents, and with its own deep history of workers' organising and cultural activity. So it ends up leading the way in some significant areas of progressive communications, and it's great to have Ian Millis here to talk about some of the activity that he was involved in. Of course, the political economy of today is not the same as it was back when all these well-known radicals were doing their thing. In the periodisation of capitalism, people sometimes refer to the visual turn, and that is the rapid proliferation of consumer capitalism. The society of the spectacle, the reified world where everything is mediated by images. To explain that a bit more, for instance, I see an ad for Coke. I don't see the person who picked the ingredients, I don't see the person in the factory, the person who transported it on a truck, took it to the factory, all the people in the factory, the people who got it into the fridge where I pick it up. I see none of that process. None of the relationships that went into it. It's all flattened. And in the end, all I see is ads about telling me to feel something if I buy it. In capitalism, it's all about being an individual, seeing things and feeling things. Our whole world is wallpapered with commodification. There's a lot of toxic culture distracting us from the best of what's out there. We're now doing everything we can to break through that white noise, get past that alienation, and to make connections and to get noticed in a world which throws up a lot of disorientation and competing things for our attention. As creative anarchists, when we strip everything back, what we're interested in is the ways that people interact with the world around them and how they make meaning out of that culture. If you're left wing, you're interested in telling a story of how the world is and what people can do to make a difference to improve things. The quest for good messaging leads us to what sort of thoughts we want our audience to have. What is probably the most important to be thoughtful about is your audience, and being focused on what you want people to take away from interacting with this artwork, what action you want them to take. And then you can think about the skills and resources you have available to execute your concept. Who might you need to collaborate with? Visuals are powerful, but there's a spectrum of other communication methods too, from podcasts to just DMing someone. And there's now a lot of potential to do high quality and complex work just from our bedrooms. But there's also a huge open space for the quick and the rough stuff. At the lowest level, the shitposting memes that are consciously amateur looking, putting up signs, street art, graffiti out in the street just for passers-by to be moved by, there's an enduring vitality to that. And we can all contribute to the dynamism of protest culture. Use yourself as a canvas in day-to-day life. Wear a political t-shirt. Have a mug with a message on it on your desk, a lanyard, or a hard hat that says you're a union member. Support a campaign or political organisation. Help with propaganda. Do some fundraising by making some stuff. Try to break through that noise in the public sphere with graffiti, a stunt, a meme, a joke, a photo, a comic. Style and tone have always been important to consider. Do we want to use jokes to expose a contradiction? Is it about getting people to be more open-minded about something? Do we want to provoke anger and injustice and inspire people to take action immediately? Do we want to promote a group and show that it has vitality, that it's cool, youthful, whatever? Do we want to make sure it looks accessible to anyone to identify with it, whatever their background? The search for middle ground. One of the hardest things to do is break through the cynicism and distancing of the media landscape and really try to make an emotional connection with a powerful, somber image. What platform is it going to be on? New technologies promote different styles and ways of communicating. The printing press, lithography, photography, electrification, telegraphic communications, air transport, film and TV, word processing, the internet, handheld devices, social media. Each one has shifted the game slightly. But the old stuff, conversations, bringing people together on the streets, organising at the point of production, that remains as useful as ever. So whether you're Bong Joon-ho or Adam McKay making big budget satires of the rich for the screen, or it's just you with a texter and a wall, there's a place for all of us to use creativity to help challenge injustice. Now, Neil Towett is going to do a bit of a show and tell that will inspire us with some different cultural objects and creative strategies that the left has been involved in, drawn from the wonderful collection at Sydney Trades Hall. Neil has been a librarian for what is now Unions New South Wales since 1995 and fell into the role of the keeper of the collection at Sydney Trades Hall from about 2003. The collection has developed from a largely trade union banner one to a large collection of approximately 4,000 union badges, 2,000 posters, pamphlets, photos, plus more banners since then. Being a librarian by calling, he just likes to find out about stuff. Welcome, Neil.
Everyone for joining us on, well, where I am is on the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to acknowledge elders past and present and future leaders, and just acknowledging that this remains their land, always was, always will be. What I propose to do today, which might be a little bit odd, is to walk around the building because I'm standing in Trades Hall, so if things go a bit wobbly every now and again, but I think it's the best way to illustrate the collection that we have. So I'm standing near the entrance at the moment. So I think I can just reverse my screen just to show you what you see when you first walk in here, which sort of backs up what Alex is saying about sort of the range of styles and things that are have been part of the union movements for a long time. And also what the last speaker of the previous session was saying about the architecture of the building doesn't make the movement, the people make the building. And I think that was really brought home to me when this building I'm standing in was being renovated in the early 2000s with the heritage architects who walked around and said, oh, we should save this, don't worry about that. And the things that they didn't see as being worth saving were very much the things that made the building what it was. The signs on the wall, the names of people, the offices which were this union or that union. And they didn't see that as being important. They just saw architectural building features rather than lived experience as being important to preserve, and to preserve that in ways which leave roughness on the staircases or a bit of a roughly painted sign on the wall, which you can see as we walk around. So just with that in mind, I'll just start with the video looking at the wall in front of me, I hope. Hang on. Hang on, it's not working now. Reverse. Maybe I'll just reverse myself. So the wall in front of me is mural by Birgitta Hansen, which was done, This mural was painted by Birgitta Hansen when this building was renovated on a wall which had previously been exposed. So she's done an 8-metre high mural on 3 walls using images of the labour movement over a long period of time. So the section right in front of me sort of traces the future of work in Australia, from Aboriginal workers up to workers of the future with the world in their hands or at their feet, as you say, with posters and slogans from various stages of the union movement over a number of years. And just to show when it was done, I think this might be in reverse for you. Your Rights at Work was in full swing at the time. Perhaps the last campaign that I can think of, it really unified workers and connected very strongly with lots of the community with a fairly straightforward, strong slogan. Your rights at work, worth fighting for, I think was such a powerful thing, I think, in comparison to the more recent Change the Rules campaign, which for various reasons I think didn't quite resonate in the same way. And again, Birgitta here has used also, and that's the Trades Hall there, but also images of old Labor Day marches and processions, as Alex was just talking about, the celebration of what had been achieved. Now, I'll just keep on walking down the stairs here to the atrium where many people have been, but so this exhibition space, again, we populate with as many current images as they can. So this is the 8-hour day banner from 1907. It's actually a reproduction of, but full size. Again, sort of seeing the sort of images of the old left, or maybe people didn't see it as the left in a sense of the 8-hour movement, but it was such a strong, amazing campaign in lots of ways. Having the success of winning 8 hours in Australia was such a strong thing carried through the union movement until the 1930s, when they actually started campaigning for a 6-hour day. But the sort of utopian feel to all that is sort of best really clearly represented in this banner, where the 3 female figures, when union representation of females was quite tiny, but representing justice, liberty and prosperity, as they say, with symbols such as the sword of justice, the scales of justice, and the horn of plenty, cornucopia, and also at the same time illustrating the importance of manufacturing industry and industrial labour in New South Wales at the time. Images which were used in lots of different union banners in different ways in Australia and in other Commonwealth countries in particular. More prosaically, more recently, here's insurance industry employees, and then they became part of the finance sector, and pretty straightforward. But again, really just branding very clearly what the union was, especially it's straight out says we're the union and we're for workers. Other more recent sort of things using old images, but and an old idea, but reprinted. There's a place called Radical Tea Towels in the UK, which people may have heard of, and in the US, who have done those top 2 banners. One Walter Crane image, again, a very an artist who did a lot of work for the British labour movement from the arts and crafts movement time, associated with Morris and Sons. Sort of just a symbolic clasped hands. I think I'm not sure where that image came from actually. And the South African Congress of Trade Unions anniversary, you know, when the South Africa was still in an apartheid state, but the union was there standing for black and white workers. Again, probably a controversial issue in the South African unions at the time itself. What I will now do is walk up the stairs here. Again, I'll just sort of walk past a few things that are hanging up, just sort of illustrating ways unions used to try in simple ways to get the message across in very straightforward terms. And also, I think illustrating how things never go away completely. So often when unions campaign now, we can usually find posters, probably perhaps done by Ian when he was here on Union Media Services, and other sort of well-known artists like Chips McAnulty, Earthworks, all sort of stuff. But lots of banners, of course, and posters are artists unknown in so many cases, and sometimes we fortunately find out, other times we don't. for encouraging union membership in itself, you know, encourage people to be part of the union in a real sort of active way. This was these old certificates, not so common in Australia. I think this one from we found recently because of the 150th anniversary of Unions New South Wales Labor Council of Sydney this year, and we found this old certificate dating back to the 1880s, I think, of the Bakers Union, which was an active union in Sydney at the time. As you imagine, baking was a pretty big trade amongst the populace. I mean, the unions who baked goods and pastry cooks were very popular floats on the 8-hour day parades, for example, because they actually had ovens on the parade where they would throw cakes and bread out to the kids, which who loved the float. And also another slightly more elaborate banner, a more recent origin by Edgar Whitbread, who is also the maker of a lot of banners that we still have in our collection. He made them from about 1900 up until probably the 20s and still kept working on them for many years after that. Much more elaborate, illustrated, illuminated address, it was called, highlighting parts of Sydney itself, but also, it's hard to read even if you're holding it right in front of you, but just highlighting the importance of Australia, Britain, you know, as a Commonwealth, British flags, but also Australian wildflowers, the thing that he did on a lot of trade union banners as well. And right in front of me now is an illustration from 1903 in the Sydney paper of an 8-hour day procession with lots of banners heading down the street. This photo was taken outside the Sydney Town Hall. So you can see how powerful the movement was across lots of sections of the community. It wasn't just a Labor movement thing, it was much more than that, I think. And the banners certainly illustrated, but there wasn't anything really radical about the banners, but they were expressing a pride in what the workers did and could do and how they ran those industries rather than working for the bosses in a lot of ways. And the crowds were the only similar crowds you'd see nowadays, I would suggest, would be Mardi Gras crowds in Sydney. Okay, I'm just going to walk up the stairs. And on the way up, I'll just show you some of the old signage which the Heritage architects weren't really interested in. Sorry, the light won't be too good here. So this was just the directory of the building, just hand painted on the wall. So this covered all the floors of the building. The names are not always legible here because it's been painted over and restored a number of times, but when we did the final restoration, he sort of saved as many union names as possible so they don't unions. You can see there's very specific unions, like there, the Piedmont Sugar Workers. The Pastoralist Union, who would have thought such a union would have an office in Trades Hall? The Labor Day Committee itself had its own offices here, quite separate to the Trades Hall management and quite separate to the peak body, the Labor Council. Okay. And into what is now the Lorna Morrison room, which was one of the original meeting rooms of this building when it was in about 1905, I think. We built this section. And on the way in, you go past this small banner. A slogan which resonates, I think you see this slogan in lots of places around the world, especially in the early part of the 20th century. And when this banner was made, would have been 1910, I believe, because the 8-hour day committee started making banners for participants in the 8-hour day parade, as long as they were fully paid up members of the thing and had in their award an amount for an 8-hour day. So you can see around the top of the room here, quite a number of these banners. Sorry, they're a bit hard to see because of the light, but all equivalent. I always think it's always interesting that we couldn't work out how unions would agree to actually have anything all exactly the same, is because they were made for the unions rather than by the individual unions. So 1910, and we know also that the 88 Days Committee was very specific about these signages and the pride of being in the 8-hour movement, because if people didn't join, their banner would be sewn over with a new union name who had paid up. Because when we restored some, we found old names underneath the new, and we had to put new silk around the outside. Otherwise, the connections here, I think, well, let's go past. Okay, this is an original union banner, which is as it was in about 1922, I do believe, though this banner is older than that, because originally it was the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, and which was a branch of the British Union, of which Tom Mann was the leading light. So the Australian Union was actually a branch of the British Union until 1968, effectively, although it did operate quite effectively. They were the Commonwealth, part of the Commonwealth Council of the Union. They became the AAU, and Edgar Whitbread, again, who had painted this banner, he has painted Amalgamated Engineering there in the centre, where it used to say Australian Amalgamated Society of Engineers, as opposed to the Australasian Society of Engineers, which is the right-wing engineering union. So this was the left, which has, of course, now become part of the AMWU. Again, the utopian figures of two women who would never have been member of this union, because they wouldn't have let women join at the time, but also the British and Australian symmetry, so British roses, waratahs and wattle and flannel flowers, you can see there. Also flags of the unions where the union had branches. So there's the flag of Malta, where they had a branch of the union. Yes, Australia. I think Canada they had a branch. There was a branch in the USA as well. There's the American flag. I can't remember where else. South Africa, there certainly was a branch. Again, and the trades that they're into too. So engineers, cranes, these big presses, shipbuilding, and boilermakers became part of that union as well, much later on. But to get to the craft of the union also was illustrated by their parade. So this photo in front of me is of the Melbourne 8-hour day parade, where the sheet metal workers, or Japanese, who also would have been part of the AMWU now, actually made suits of armour and wore them on the parade to illustrate the skill of their craft. And the symbols on the banner there, which is the Melbourne branch, is the same symbol that is used all around the world for this union. The Sydney branch also made a suit of armour, so there it is right in front of you, and also this regalia, which has, you can see the 888, I think you can make that out, on the horse regalia and on the horse blankets. And there's a small number there, which is part of the order of procession of the parades. The idea, because they were drawn out of a hat, and that helped unions. So someone would carry one of the small banners on a pole with the number sticking on top of the pole, so that union members could find where they were in the march. Okay, and again, so there's the 6-hour day and the 8-hour day banner up there. Again, the 8-hour day is such a strong symbol for, which was used in lots of different ways. And next to it is a copy of the Stonemasons Society, but the Stonemasons were the first ones to claim an 8-hour day in Sydney. And there we have the Sydney University, and I think the Art Gallery of New South Wales depicted on their banner. The thing that happened in the 1920s, they started agitating for a 6-hour day, but then the demand became more urgent and more defensive for the 1930s and the Depression. So here's this banner, which was actually a remake from the 50s, but there they've called it the 6-hour day. And we have a number of banners where they've changed the 888 to 6. And this one was just a straight 6, because unfortunately it never happened. This is United Furnishing Society banner, and all those smaller unions who had those little banners, and there are probably little banners of all those unions. There they are, depicted on this banner made by Althouse and Geiger in the 1950s. More recently, we've got a currently plug for myself, a Jack Mundy exhibition going on, but the power of print and posters is probably one of, as Alex has talked about, posters. This is a poster from Victoria Street days, which Ian probably is more familiar with, but this is very clear and powerful representation of the forces at play in Victoria Street and what people were up against. And in memory of, certainly probably after Monika was killed, but also the struggles there were just so desperate and violent in a lot of ways, but so powerful community sense. Sorry, I'm jumping topics here, but other aspects, there's cartooning, which Alex has also mentioned. This is by an artist called Tom Martin, who did a lot of work for the Railways Union and for the Miners Federation, and also for that one there, I would suggest was done for the waterside workers regarding Pigline Bob. But he did do a lot of cartooning for a union, but not so well known, but he couldn't make a living out of it like so many union artists. So he actually did a work for the tax office as well to pay the bills. More recently, badges and buttons of highlighting particular campaigns rather than small buttons and badges which represent your union membership became more common. So here's a number here from Australia and around the world. So, but I think more recent, the Rights at Work campaign was certainly a very powerful campaign with, again, a very straightforward image, set of words, but very clear and ambiguous. The anti-war campaigns amongst unions was a big factor. So jobs, not war. We have lots of posters about that as well as badges and buttons. Protecting, there's the sun, so there's again anti-Rupert Murdoch badge from the UK. Protecting public sector jobs, RMT, keep the guards on the train, very current campaign here in Australia as well. Keep water public, protecting public services. Again, all these things we fight and fight for over and over again, sadly, and you cannot relax because the bosses don't. Again, there's a whopping dispute against Murdoch. Again, American issue, municipal hospitals not for sale. The other things the Americans are very good at were also, I think, the union label. So here's a poster, spend for union services. So, how to keep union workers in a job, and also to make sure we get quality, because the unions would campaign for their members to be paid properly, but also there was also a guarantee to the public that you would get really good quality work from union-made goods and services. So they actually published an annual booklet about this, Fight for the Union label. One of the unions that was very strong on this was this one, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So there's some extraordinary stuff for arguing for the union label. They, of course, link back to the Triangle Factory fire in the US in the early 1900s, but and they commemorate that every year with a march in New York. But they made pin cushions and all those plastic hats or umbrellas, but all, and you can still, if you go on eBay, if you look at ILGW, you will find a huge range of clothing, often excellent quality vintage clothing from the US, made by union workers. Okay, and more examples of union work.
Neil?
Yep.
I think we might need to wind it up there.
No worries. Okay, so just one more thing. I would say one of the most powerful union labels, which was very effective in America, was this one, was the United Farm Workers Union. That's Cesar Chavez there now, Cesar's later failings. That the eagle that they used as their union emblem was so strong in their boycott campaign, which they carried not just from the fields where they finally won a contract, but also to the eastern states of America, where they used that label to urge people not to buy non-union grapes at the supermarkets. And just one last thing, this guy was the very first grower to sign up to the union. And we found this box with his label on, where he agreed to have the union label stamped onto the boxes of his fruit. So again, that campaign was fought and won, probably finally lost in the end over many, many years, because it just had to keep on fighting on. So that's about all I can say if I run out of time, but as you can see, there's lots of symbols and imagery here covering lots of different subjects. And I'm happy to show anyone around whenever they would like to. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Neil. And yeah, people, when they're in Sydney, they should get along and check it out for themselves. Otherwise, the social media account of Sydney Trades Hall is wonderful. So they're doing a really good job in curating and displaying their collection. So give them a follow as well. On to our next presentation. Ian McIntyre is a Melbourne-based historian, author, and community radio broadcaster. In recent years, he's collected together thousands of cartoons published in the US by the industrial workers of the world from the 1900s to the 1940s. He is currently working with Canada's Graphic History Collective on an anthology of comics featuring the character of Mr. Block and on a broader collection of IWW cartoons and comics for PM Press. Today, he'll be providing a history of the American IWW and its cartoons. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Alex. First up, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking and whose sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay respect to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Thanks to Alex and everyone else involved in organising today's event. So I'll start out with some history about the industrial workers of the world, who are also known as the IWW or the Wobblies. And that'll give you some context for the cartooning work that they were involved in. So formed in Chicago in 1905, the industrial workers of the world emerged during a time of particularly predatory capitalism. This was a time in the United States during which poverty was widespread, child labour was common, and the right to dissent was heavily repressed. From its inception, the IWW played a leading role in American radical activity. It declared in its preamble that, quote, the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. And it put forth a vision of class struggle in the workplace, which rejected reliance on social change via political parties and politicians. The solution to hunger, unemployment, and the social division instead would be found in the formation of one big union. This one big union, or OBU, would include all workers, regardless of the job they did, or their gender, ethnicity, and language. The tools to win improvements in wages and conditions and to support struggles for free speech and against war were many and varied, but the focus was always on direct action by the rank and file. That is, the use of strikes, boycotts, go-slows, and civil disobedience, which remain under the control of all workers, not union leaders, politicians, or other representatives at the top of a hierarchy. The idea was that once the IWW had been built up to a great enough degree, a new world would be realised via a massive general strike in which workers would take, quote, possession of the earth and the machinery of production to abolish the wage system. The IWW aimed from the beginning, in its own words, to form the structure of the new society within the shell of the old. And this wasn't just through the creation of organisational forms to supplant and fight capitalism, but also through creating a revolutionary counterculture involving music, theatre, public speaking, and cartoons. Now, the union established itself as a force within timber and agricultural industries and reached a peak membership of more than 100,000 workers in the United States during the 1920s. And the overwhelming majority of its membership was drawn from the poorest sections of the working class. In the US, the union published around 90 newspapers in the first half of the 20th century, and these came out in multiple cities and were in over a dozen languages. The union had its most success amongst radical migrants, as well as with workers employed in precarious, often short-term jobs done often by hobos. These groups, along with women and African Americans, were all shunned and sometimes attacked by mainstream unions. The IWW faced concerted employer and government repression. It was denounced in the mainstream press and was banned in a number of states. Over 100 IWW members were murdered by company thugs, police, and right-wing mobs from the 1900s to the 1930s. And thousands more were injured and jailed for short and long-term periods. When this repression was combined with competition from emerging communist parties and with internal disputes, the IWW was reduced to a small international network of activists by the 1930s. Nevertheless, it continues to be active in many countries today, including Australia. Now, the IWW was formed in the US, and as the huge majority of its cartoons were produced there, I'm going to be focusing on that country today. But we should note that its cartoons historically had a major impact here in Australia. Sid Nichols, whose work appears on this slide, started his career producing cartoons for the Australian IWW newspaper Direct Action in 1915. He went on to become the creator of Fatty Finn, which some of us of a certain vintage will remember. This was a popular comic strip published in daily Australian newspapers from the 1920s to the 70s. And Nichols also did cartoons for teachers and media unions later in life. Demonstrating the fear that the IWW and its cultural forms could evince, one of his anti-war cartoons led to Direct Action's editor being jailed in New South Wales during 1916. Okay, so we've already seen a variety of IWW cartoons while I was providing that very potted history. I'll not talk about how they were used to build the union and share its ideas. So cartoons formed part of the IWW's broader project to recast cultural forms primarily used within American society to generate profit, advertise products, and reinforce dominant economic and social practices and ideas. Mass-produced newspapers, leaflets, posters, stickers, and cartoons were used by the IWW and other radicals to frame a very different set of values in ways which subverted and retooled both format and content. Far more memorable and arresting than text alone, radical cartoons provided a condensed, attention-grabbing means of education and rabble-rousing. And they played three broad roles, all of which crossed over and reinforced one another. Firstly, in both humorous and serious forms, cartoons expressed grievances, highlighted problems, and challenged dominant ideas about how the world worked and how it got to be the way it was. Secondly, cartoons were used to show how society could be changed, as well as utopian visions of what it might become. They distilled concepts regarding class and struggle into a simple, digestible form. And lastly, cartoons lifted spirits, provided laughs, and in doing so fostered a sense of solidarity and collective identity. Since humour and irreverence were a key part of the IWW from its inception, it's hardly surprising to find that the union embraced cartoons as an art form. In terms of identifying problems and explaining concepts to do with class and exploitation, cartoons were part of a broader visual culture of the left, which helped create, inculcate, and codify many of the classic tropes of left-wing imagery during that era. Bosses and tycoons were not visionaries who generated wealth and progress for all, but instead were depicted as gluttonous, top-hatted, cigar-smoking symbols of capital excess, whose thievery caused poverty and misery. Police, militiamen, private security and company guards were not bold upholders of the law, but dull-witted thugs. Generals were murderous overlords and judges corrupt enforcers. Mainstream news journalists and editors were portrayed as cowardly and unprincipled liars. While the creation and diffusion of these tropes were part of a joint effort across the international left, the IWW's extra-parliamentary militancy and rejection of hierarchy meant that union bureaucrats, the clergy, and politicians of all types joined the ranks of the venal and nefarious. In IWW cartoons, as elsewhere on the left, when the focus was on highlighting injustice, exploitation, and repression, then workers often appeared as starved, broken, and vulnerable figures. Conservative workers were often satirised, and particularly by the IWW, and the most famous character in this respect was Mr. Block, who's seen here on the left. Block was a patriotic bumbler who, no matter how many times he was ripped off and mistreated by workers and politicians and others, continued to wholeheartedly believe in the American way. Block was the creation of Ernest Reeve, and he was immortalised in a song by IWW martyr Joe Hill, and strips featuring him were collected into America's first radical comic book in 1913. Now, when associated with struggle and the yet barely harnessed possibility of class power, workers were typically depicted as a mass or a powerful fist, or sometimes both, or were embodied in the figure of virile, barrel-chested he-men. Sometimes the IWW and revolutionary unionism more generally took the form of Lady Liberty, or around May Day as a springtime goddess. The IWW's distinctive advocacy of direct action tactics was often symbolised within the union by a black cat, or in keeping with overseas contemporaries, with wooden shoes known as sabots. Now, this imagery initially appeared in text form, but such symbols were fully given life in the US through their use in IWW cartoons. Many industries that the IWW covered in its early years, such as migratory, agricultural, construction and lumber work associated with hobos, were almost entirely carried out by men lacking dependents. And as such, the majority of the union's membership were male. Nevertheless, the union also organised women in service and textiles industries, and as workers, family members and community members, women made a huge contribution to the IWW's work and were central to many of its campaigns. The IWW press distinguished itself by rarely engaging in sexist and racist jokes and language, and it also opposed campaigns by mainstream unions to keep women, immigrants and others out of workplaces. However, while on many levels being very progressive for its time, a number of sections of the IWW, along with other left-wing radicals, still cleave to gender divisions regarding the workplace household binary, and the IWW's public persona was largely masculine. Similarly, while African Americans made up and led sections of the union, they rarely appeared visually. One way that the IWW differed from much of the radical left was in the number of cartoonists involved in its press and the sheer numbers of cartoons it published. These far outstripped those of other organisations and publications because, as in all aspects of its work, the union always encouraged members to contribute in any way they could. As a result, rather than employing a few professional full-time artists, as most left-wing newspapers did, the IWW press featured scores of volunteer artists. As part of making itself accessible to all workers, the IWW kept its membership fees as low as possible. It didn't seek to build a treasury, and it put all of its finances back into grassroots campaigns and propaganda. Now, with only a tiny paid staff overall, the IWW did not pay its cartoonists or other contributors, and this was on the grounds of both principle and practicality. The financial and other limitations placed on both artists and the union in turn encouraged the use of cartoons, as these were cheaper and quicker to produce and reproduce than other visual art forms. The majority of cartoons and illustrations published by the union were pseudonymous. Many artists didn't sign their work, or they attributed it to their union membership number, used a pictogram, a union label, or a moniker. This in part reflected the non-hierarchical and self-effacing nature of the union, but also the anonymity of hobo culture to which many IWW members belonged. For some artists, it likely also flowed from the dangers of being identified as a member, particularly if they were working for mainstream newspapers or in the commercial world. In keeping with both the style of the time and the limitations placed on amateurs with limited resources, and by the cheap printing used by the union, the majority of cartoons that appeared in IWW newspapers were single panel black ink drawings on paper accompanied by a caption. Some artists, however, did use brushes, create lino and block cuts, and some produced multi-panel narrative comics. Generally, cartoons first appeared on the front or back cover of newspapers, as well as in the union's more in-depth journals. Being an easily reproducible form, cartoons were reprinted across newspapers in various languages. They also appeared in poster, postcard, and leaflet form, and on the back and on the cover of books and pamphlets. IWW members were part of a thriving working class culture of self-education. And wherever a branch was big enough, a union hall with a library was set up, often sharing many of the newspapers and cartoons that we've seen. Cartoons appealed to those well-versed in movement literature, but also helped draw in newcomers and those with minimal literacy or for whom English was an additional language. Often beginning with cartoon captions, some radical migrants taught themselves to read via IWW newspapers, albeit with what historian Doug Haller calls a wobbly accent. So freed of constraints of bureaucracy and encouraged to undertake action as they saw fit, the membership of the IWW experimented with many tactics, and I'll wrap up with one last one. Other than employing cartoons to a degree not seen elsewhere on the left, the IWW also pioneered the use of stickers featuring cartoons and illustrations. These were dubbed stickerettes or silent agitators. And they were placed on lampposts, walls, toilets, and various other public places, as well as at hobo and radical meeting spots. And they were also used in workplaces, particularly when members were too isolated to take other forms of action, but wanted to show that IWW members were about. Unlike today's stickers, these were more akin to postage stamps in that they had glue on the back, so they had to be licked or dabbed. And by 1917, over 1 million stickers had been distributed around the US, with over 65,000 in languages other than English. So in closing, I hope that this brief and rushed history has helped you gain an appreciation of how cartoons have historically been used to spread ideas and popularise radical symbols and thinking. I also hope we can all follow in the wobbly tradition of taking forms and content from the commercial world by redeploying today's tropes and technology in order to agitate, educate, and organise. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. Ian has a number of books out, including the classic How to Make Trouble and Influence People. And you got that, which you guys will be interested in. His recent publications include Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Sci-Fi 1950 to 1984, Environmental Blockades out in Routledge this year, and On the Fly, Hobo Literature and Songs, 1879 to 1941 on PM Press. He is a member of the Commons Library team and regularly contributes articles about social movement history to that website. Our next speaker is Lisa Milner. Lisa is a Labor historian whose interests circulate around the intersections of cultural activism and politics and include radical and workers' theatre in Anglophone nations, representations of workers and unions on screen, and Labor history. Her work has been published widely in Australia, UK, and the USA, including in Labor history, contemporary British history, American Communist history, Australasian Drama Studies, and New Theatre Quarterly. She is the Vice President of Interventions Publishing. Welcome, Lisa.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming here. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Gumbaynggirr Nation, which is the land I'm joining you from today. And I'd like to express my appreciation for the organisers of this great session. I'm moving on a couple of decades from Ian's great talk, and I'm moving to the 1950s today. And basically, I want to present to you an argument that the 1950s in Australia was really a notable decade for a flourishing of activity amongst creative people on the left of the political spectrum, at least in the cities. And the landscape of this left cultural activism, I call it, has left a rich and often unacknowledged legacy for contemporary Australian creatives, political activists and intellectuals. And I believe it provides a really, really vital case study in cultural politics and networking. So today, like Ian's given you a rushed history of the wobbly graphic art scene, I'm going to give you an introduction to the rich diversity of Australian left cultural activist groups in the post-war period. Now, as two forms of protest, political activism and artistic activism fed into each other most energetically through the Communist Party in Australia. And from its earliest times in the 20s, the CPA had encouraged the energies of creative people, and culture in its most broadest sense was a topic that really was a big issue of debate from time to time. And members of the CPA, as well as the Russian Communist Party, and the urged writers and painters to draw their subjects from the working class. And it was really an important thing. This led really to the refinement of the party directive on cultural production, the tenets of which became known as socialist realism. And the basic ideal here was the development of the view of art as a weapon, where art had a directly political purpose, which was the propelling of society towards communism. And in Australia particularly, there was a shared moral economy amongst these left cultural activists, people with strongly held opinions on social justice, faith in the importance of collective action drove these groups. They often organised and mobilised their own creative resources to establish and sustain their groups. And they relied on formal as well as informal networks of communication. They aimed to provide not just artistic, but broader educational and sometimes political training. And they used the technologies and forms of existing art forms for oppositional purposes. Now, one of the earliest manifestations of the party's involvement in creative work was the establishment of the Workers' Arts Club in 1932. Writer Jean Devaney was its most prominent founder, while visual artist George Finey was president. And the Workers' Arts Club was apparently completely democratic, according to one of its members, and it encouraged cultural production as a response to the high unemployment and poor living conditions of the Depression. From about 1935, other organisations replaced the WAC, and many of these groups reported to the party's Arts Committee, where they received advice, direction, criticism and censorship. Some of this was taken and much of it was ignored, I must say. One of the most important aspects of social realism, as it was manifested, I guess, in post-war Australia, was its encouragement of a collective approach. The groups were often established and administered by party members, but membership was by no means restricted. They extended the party's aims to interest, entertain and educate a wide spectrum of society, including Labor Party members, rank and file workers, intellectuals and artists. The groups thrived as social and political as well as creative collectives, and in all these groups the solidarity and support of members was important. Now, according to these groups and their output, Australian traditions and themes in the 1950s were more authentic manifestations of Australian identity than those were embodied in the so-called Australian way of life. The post-war decade brought with it a very energetic invigoration of these ideas, with the party's moves to establish a cultural offensive. The New Theatre performed newly written as well as older Australian plays on explicitly Australian themes. The realist writers looked to Lawson and Furphy for inspiration, and a revival of interest in anti-authoritarian themes contributed to this type of radical nationalism. Convicts, bushrangers and the rebels of Eureka were in vogue. But this was also a highly problematic and selective exploration of Australian nationalism, as we realise in hindsight. And while the tradition of the pioneers was seen as the rightful working class formation of the Australian national heritage, it generally often ignored women, migrants and Indigenous Australians. Looking back on these left-wing artists of 1950s Australia, it's true that while they shared a collectivist impulse which valued their relationships with other artistic and political activists, and a great interest in peace and equality, so did their frequent omission of women immigrants and Indigenous Australians. I'd like to introduce to you the most active and important left cultural groups in post-war Australia. And perhaps the most important group in the 50s was the New Theatre, also the country's oldest continually performing theatre, with many hundreds of plays produced and written by Australian and overseas dramas. Non-professional actors were the mainstream of productions, although many well-known performers were to come out of the New Theatre family. Perhaps more significant were its writers, who constituted an important contribution to Australian literature. The theatre's strong tradition of performing socially and politically relevant work attracted a predominantly working class following, both artist and audience. Often contemporary industrial and political situations were the inspiration. Anti-war and anti-oppression themes were the staple, and topical reviews were common. And this is this slide shows the original founding New Theatre principles. You can see through this the influence of the Australian themes to get away from commercialism and basically an idea of social justice. Now, the New Theatre's commitment to these broadly socialist ideas extended to their performative style, and the New Theatre was unique in Australia in its range of performance sites. Theatre members would perform at parks and beaches, next to dole queues, and from trucks. During the 1949 coal strike, for instance, a concert party travelled from Sydney to the Newcastle Theatre to entertain the strike-bound workers and their families. And in 1952, a play was performed down a mine at Glen Davis, west of Sydney. Requests for performances would come from factories, rural and regional localities, and country towns. And New Theatre members would often produce plays or short sketches for unions or other left organisations. In particular, the Sydney New Theatre and the Sydney branch of the Waterside Workers Federation enjoyed a very long-standing alliance. New Theatre member Betty Rowland wrote War on the Waterfront in response to the 1938 pig iron dispute, for example. It played in Sydney to appreciative audiences, and also the police who stopped performances and arrested actors in the Domain. Now, New Theatre member Jock Levy has spoken of the role communists played within the theatre. He said they gave it vigour, a commitment, and undoubtedly played a vital role in the development of the theatre, presenting a working class perspective. In the 1950s, when party membership was at its peak, the New Theatre was seen as the party's main and foremost enterprise in that area of cultural activity. Turning from theatre to literature, the Realist Writers Association is a leading organisation. It was formed in 1944, initially in Melbourne, by Frank Hardy, Stephen Murray Smith and Eric Lambert. And it had two initial aims: the encouragement and development of worker writers and the continuation of a perceived, again, national democratic and realist tradition. The realist writers had important roles in arguments establishing the existence and worthiness of Australian literature. And Frank Hardy claimed that the initial task of the realists was to promote literature written about the working class, by the working class, for the realists, for the working class. Realist writers included Jack Coffey, Judah Whiten, Edgar Ross, Len Fox, Roger Millis, Mona Brand, Dorothy Hewitt, Ujuru Nunuckle, Ralph de Boissier, Rodney Hall, Dennis Kevins, and Gavin Casey. The Sydney Realist was formed in 1954, and it had part of the energies of Melbourne and Sydney realist writers came into the establishment of the Australian Book Society, which was a cooperative publishing house established in 1952. The ABS featured Australian novels by realist members and others, and it also supplied international fiction works of a broadly left-wing nature. They also produced a journal for their members, and they formed branches in other states with an enrolment of thousands of members. As well as publishing local work, they started discussion groups, perhaps the first book clubs in Australia, and they conducted readings in factories, libraries and halls. And today, the publishing company Interventions continues the work of the ABS. Turning again briefly to visual arts, SORA, the Studio of Realist Art, was established in Sydney in 1945. SORA artists included Noel Coonahan, Dora Chapman, Herb McClintock, Sally Herman, Nan Horton, Clem Seal, Marjorie Penglaze and Jean Kelly. As well as a working artist studio, the space was used for art classes of all kinds of meetings. The working class viewpoint was central to socialist realism in the SORA studio, where members often used the working class Australian for its subject. One of the most well-known SORA artists was Noel Coonahan, seen by some as the only socialist realist to purpose his popular, unpopular art from one decade to the next. Like other cultural activists, SORA artists worked with trade unions and helped striking workers so as to acknowledge the unity of artists' problems with those of the working people. Turning now to film and the Waterside Workers Federation Film Unit. At least in the 1950s, this was the only film production unit in the world that was funded by a trade union. The establishment of the union was possible through the industrial strength and large membership of the communist-controlled federation and the general vision of the leaders to accept that film could be a useful tool of propaganda under the leadership of Big Jim Healy. There were 3 members of the film unit, Jock Levy, Keith Gower and Norma Disher, and the unit operated from 1953 to 1958. All of these 3 were also members of the New Theatre, and up to 1956 were members of the Communist Party. Levy and Gower worked on the wharves as well as in film, and Disher was soon employed by the Federation as a filmmaker. The inspiration for the unit came from the New Theatre as well as from the party. Jock Levy was certain, he said, that the Communist Party gave us the impetus and the discipline that made it possible for us to work so effectively as a film unit. And what the film unit members gained from this affiliation was an impetus to articulate their perceptions of social justice and working class solidarity. The film unit ended up producing 17 films on subjects that other film production units in the 1950s would never tackle, things like housing shortages, industrial disputes from the union members' viewpoint, and important issues about workers' rights and workers' health and safety. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of this group's work, for me at least, was the low-cost, highly innovative and very personal methods the workers used to get their films seen by as many people as possible. They bought a combi van, which you can see here, which was in the 1956 May Day March, that they used as their production vehicle. And the van was also used to screen films. They projected films from inside the van onto a screen on the door, and in that way, they could show films in daylight. You know, a vanner on the van boasting that we film the facts. By travelling around in this way and taking films to the people instead of the other way around, the unit was able to have direct contact with a surprisingly large audience. And down in Melbourne, the Realist Film Unit had predated the Wharfies Film Unit and was basically the first organisation in Australia to produce labour films in any quantity. It came into existence in 1945 with Ken Waldecott donating his wartime pay from the RAAF of £300 to found the unit. Caldecott had been involved in screening Soviet films for the Labour Club at Melbourne Uni in the 1930s, and he went on to become manager of Friends of the Soviet Union and to support the Spanish Relief Committee. Caldecott was joined by Bob Matthews, who had a long association with the Melbourne New Theatre, along with Betty Lacey and Jerry Herant, who found that participating in such collective is immensely satisfying. Like the Wharfies Film Unit in Sydney, the Realists had strong connections with the Melbourne New Theatre, and they screened films in venues that ranged from the Melbourne New Theatre's venues to living rooms to large halls. Oh, excuse me. The popularity of folk music also grew in the 50s, and it was a time, Len Fox says, when everyone seemed to be singing far and wide. Many local music and drama enthusiasts took up the call to promote an Indigenous folk music celebration. After the huge popularity of the New Theatre's Reedy River, the Communist Party formed the People's Choir and the Unity Singers. New Theatre actor and vocalist Cedric McLaughlin coordinated the Link Singers, and there was a Sydney Bush Music Club, to which many of these singers and musicians belonged. I guess perhaps you might think that these were amongst the most lyrical manifestations of a radical nationalist movement. In those years, we had the Australian Folklore Society, we had wattle recordings and a folk music record club. And like many concerns of left cultural groups, there was some resistance from mainstream media to the push to popularise folk music. Peter Hamilton, who established wattle recordings, told me about some problems he faced. He said folk music was seen in the McCarthy area as being subversive, and that had an effect in Australia. And so the ABC, for example, who I was trying to encourage to play these songs, wouldn't play them because they were dangerous. And so, you know, this is the sort of thing that was happening in the 1950s in a whole wide network, an intersecting network of groups, mostly in Melbourne and Sydney, but in other cities as well. And whilst the political culture of mainstream art, including its intellectual supports, had strong middle class attachments, social and economic dependencies on class institutions, the collectivist impulse in these groups was as strong as the political impulse in the Communist Party and in the militant labour movement more widely. These groups extended the labour movement's aims to interest, entertain and educate, I guess, a wide spectrum of society. Their functions included the constitution of social and political as well as cultural collectives. And in all these groups, the solidarity and support of members working together as a team was very important. As artist workers, these left cultural activists chose to stand up for their politics and they chose to resist conservative views. And I think they can give us a lot of lessons to share for present and future cultural activism. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa. Lisa has several books that you can search out. Her book on the radical film units in Australia would be of particular interest to this audience. It's called Fighting Films. And in exciting news, there's also a forthcoming book that Lisa is putting together about the new theatre due next year. So if you want to keep up to date with release dates or check in with the website interventions.org.au, or you may like to support the left-wing publishing of books such as these by subscribing to the Interventions Patreon at patreon.com/interventions. Now, our next and last speaker is Ian Millis. Ian is a Sydney-based artist, writer and activist who began working with trade unions as a resident activist in the Green Band movement. He was later one of the founders of the Art Workers Union and Union Media Services. He ended his 20 years of working with unions as a National Research Officer for the Federated Miscellaneous Workers Union, now part of the United Workers Union. His current major activity is the Kandos School of Cultural Adaptation. A group of artists, farmers and others engage in a radical agriculture and land use experiments. Welcome, Ian.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Yep, okay. Thanks, Alex. Look, I'd like to acknowledge the elders of the Darug and Gundungurra people whose elders who were the tribes in the Blue Mountains, where I currently live. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land here. It's very interesting because I'm going to have the least visual, as a visual artist, I'm going to have the least visual presentation simply because our house is being renovated and all my archives are buried under heaps of furniture and boxes. So you're really just going to get my talking head, but hopefully that'll be entertaining enough. Look, in the late 1970s, despite fairly high levels of union membership and quite a lot of shop floor activism, union communication with their membership was pretty poor. Its strength and its weakness was that in many ways it had become an oral culture of two-way communication through delegates and shop stewards with the occasional workplace meeting or even mass meetings in a crisis. Most unions had very basic publications, but once upon a time unions had owned newspapers, radio stations, even film units, as other speakers have mentioned. But these had gradually been sold off or turned into purely commercial operations or just closed down. And the end result, the worst of the end result, was the blowers, as they were called, the companies which ran trade union publications as a very profitable sort of standover operation. The idea was a union would get for free an incredibly basic publication, which would have, say, a report from the secretary, a few other industrial stories that alternated with pages of ads from employers. Ads that didn't actually advertise anything other than the employer's name. The employers, of course, were basically coerced into the advertising. Most of the money went to the publishing company, with the union getting a small payoff and the free publication. You know, sometimes a bit of cash, but not usually. It was a bit shocking, the large number of union secretaries who thought this was a good deal. You know, all a bit of a wheeze that they were making the employers pay. You know, where was the problem? You know, and maybe it was just a lack of media literacy that made them unable to recognise that more than anything, it destroyed both their credibility and their ability to communicate. But this setup had a very strong hold on the union movement, and even the ACTU itself had such publication. In the whole country, you could count on the fingers of one hand the number of real journalists who were employed by trade unions. But, you know, we're talking the late 70s, the times really had been changing. The generation who'd been radicalised by the Vietnam War and then the brief Whitlam era and its collapse were by the late 1970s moving into positions of power in the union movement. And even the art world, which had, with a few rare exceptions until the mid-1970s, espoused a contempt for politics, had changed enormously. And by the late 70s, it was awash with political activism fronted by young artists painting murals and screen printing posters. And this is where I came in, right? I'd begun as a formalist painter in the late 1960s. My work quickly developed into a form of conceptual art involving audience participation and then into working with communities in the Green Band movement. And as I developed the idea that artists really were cultural activists rather than small business people manufacturing content for the art industry. I was not interested in doing posters or murals, but what I was interested in was developing communication systems. And so when a group of Australian artists, Ian Byrne, Terry Smith and Nigel Lendon, who had been involved in art and language in New York, the Art and Language Group, which is the foremost conceptual art group in the world, really, when they returned to Australia in the late 1970s, a group of us formed a sort of unwieldy collaborative called the Media Action Group, which produced education slideshows for tertiary institutions analysing media issues. But we also took on a few small publishing jobs, like the layout for a publication called The Job Killers, which was produced by the left-wing think tank, the Transnational Co-op. And we produced a few graphs for the metalworkers publication, Australia Uprooted, an extraordinary publication which they put into news agencies and sold in the hundreds of thousands, right? So it showed that there was a strange, unexplored appetite out there for leftish media. Now, this brought us to the attention of a journalist called Dale Curling, who was newly employed to upgrade the monthly newspaper of the ATEA, the telecom union. And we started to do this, but it quickly became a bit of a burden for all the others. And especially as Dale and I became friends, we began thinking through all the possibilities that it would be possible to develop a network of union publications that could effectively act as a counterbalance to the mainstream media if we provided quality publishing services and syndicated material between them. You know, we could accumulate audiences, large audiences out of small audiences. And as we began gathering up more jobs, most of the Media Action Group members sort of dropped off. You know, they weren't uninterested, but it was just too hard for them to do it because they couldn't put the time in. And so we began employing people. And in 1980, we rented an office in Sydney Trades Hall, just above where Neil is. Only Ian Byrne quit his academic job to join the new organisation, Union Media Services, as it became, and some of the others became board members. Now, Union Media Services was a proof of concept kind of model for a new type of organisation in the union movement. Within a few years, there were similar organisations in all the other states pretty much, providing media and publicity services for unions. like Toad Show in Brisbane or Publicity Works in Melbourne, and then later Social Change Media also in Sydney. But Union Media Services was the first, and for a long time the largest. I think I worked out at one point we'd worked for something like 50 different unions at least, doing regular publications and or working on specific campaigns. It came at a critical point when the unions really needed to improve their act if they were to counter the constant mass media attacks through better communication with their members. For us as artists, the artwork was the crafting of a model system. So we were less interested than many of our peers were in making striking, innovative imagery, or, as many of them were doing posters, like my friend Mark O'Callaghan at Redback Graphics. Right? We tried to mimic the mass media to some extent, to steal the familiarity of their approach, while presenting entirely different content. And in another way, like social media later did, we were building up a mass audience, as I said, by linking many different union audiences together. It was at this point in 1981 that the Australia Council appeared on the scene. It had been operating for a few years, having been set up by Whitlam, but Fraser had appointed a former Liberal Party president, Timothy Pascoe, as its director. To everyone's surprise, I must say, he turned out to be genuinely small L Liberal, and his marketing background led him to see access as the priority, that what the arts needed above all was bums on seats, and he was open to innovative ways of achieving this. The Community Arts Board was set up, and Pascoe backed a policy called the Art and Working Life Program, developed by the board's arts officer, Deb Mills, which aimed to use unions and employers as a way to provide accessible arts projects in the workplace. This dovetailed neatly with a recently ratified ACTU policy that had been developed by Laurie Carmichael called the Arts and Creative Recreation Policy, which proposed that arts and leisure were as much trade union business as what happened in the workplace. The Australia Council and the ACTU policies together began by funding trade unions' arts officers in the labour councils, and to initially facilitate things like workplace lunchtime concerts, theatre, murals, whatever, right? But the board then approached a number of artists who were already working with trade unions, like us, Redback Graphics, the muralist Jeff Hogg, in Melbourne, and many others, right? And through a series of seminars and conferences, we all contributed further ideas. The ultimate outcome was over the next few years was an overwhelmingly successful Australia Council program that was overtly socially progressive, that helped fund union campaigns around a number of issues like occupational health and safety, sexual harassment, multicultural issues, racism, and more, while providing employment for artists, actors, musicians and writers. Graham Pitt's play Mesh, for instance, performed by Sidetrack Theatre in workplaces, at one stage had the country's highest ever audience numbers for live theatre production. It became a really big program, over the next 5, 6, 7 years, up to the late 80s. Union Media was also employed then by the Australia Council to write and produce a number of publications about the program. And we also were funded for several projects, the most noticeable being the embroidered Actors Equity banner, which was in Alex's series of slides at the beginning. The most significant thing we did, I believe, was less glamorous, but it was the development of an art and working life news service, which provided monthly news articles about art and working life projects, or that were already designed and laid out, so it could just simply be painted into any trade union, posted into any trade union publication. This model was later picked up in the early 90s by the ACTU for campaigning. And in fact, I think you can say that improved trade union communication can claim a lot of credit for helping Keating win the election he never thought he'd win. Union Media's rapid media services growth created problems of its own. Dale quit early on, preferring to work freelance, and after a series of disagreements about financial problems and direction, I was pushed out in the mid-80s, and like Dale, I then worked freelance for a number of unions until joining the Miscellaneous Workers Union in 1990. But we'd set the ball rolling, And now most unions were recognising the need to drastically modernise their communications, especially as the Hawke-Keating era union amalgamations created both the necessity and the increased funding base to make it possible. So more journalists wanted to work in the area, which had previously been regarded as very low status journalism. And TUTA, the Trade Union Training Authority, was training union officials to understand that improved communication could benefit their activities, while also providing them with the tools to do it. I ran regular publishing courses for them, while the ABC's Jane Singleton trained them in interview technique. Desktop publishing had also arrived, making it possible for unions to set up small production units of their own in-house. And the desktop publishing system I developed for the MISOs produced targeted publications for particular industry groups, different states. Using outside providers like Social Change Media, we created a full-colour publication with production values equal to anything coming out of mainstream media. It was a bit like New Idea, the trade union magazine. At that point, in a sense, for me, my work was done. I'd basically achieved everything that I personally wanted to do, and that was more or less my last major work for unions. But the unions themselves continued to improve their approach and adopted the full panoply of modern communications in the next decade or so, both in production and market research and so on. But even though I'd helped create a contemporary communication infrastructure for the union movement, in the end, I'd actually failed at one of the most important objectives. I'd been saying all through this endlessly to various union officials that whether they realised it or not, they were in a culture war to maintain the role of the union movement as a whole in society, and that they had to use cultural weapons like media of every sort to do this. I think because this wasn't fully recognised or understood and never fully carried out, that it was possible for Howard to virtually destroy much of the trade union movement during his time in power. The strong identity of unionism that had previously existed was diminishing, and it was not capable of withstanding his legal attacks. So the first thing to fall was, of course, the Art and Working Life program. It had been under constant political attack by the Liberals, who thought it was great fun to lampoon the idea of unions being in any way involved in the arts, which they believed to be upmarket entertainment strictly for their wealthy friends. But Keating did just as much damage with his own autodidactic amateurism, which, like the Liberals, saw the arts as a badge of superiority. It was him that began the rhetoric about excellence that's ever since served to isolate the arts and prevent them being regarded as an everyday activity open to all. Despite being one of the most successful programs ever when judged by the usual criteria, the Art and Working Life program also aroused a lot of resentment in the traditional arts boards, and so the Australia Council slowly began to close it down, first by devolving the funding to the ACTU and to administer it, and then by cutting it off completely. A program for workers and unions begun under a Liberal government and died under a Labor, and an enormously more effective trade union communication system that it was part of still wasn't enough to protect unions from the advance of neoliberalism, especially considering the fact that the ALP itself had turned neoliberal. So I think there's a few things to consider in thinking about all that and where we are now. But thank you, Alex. It's been a great session.
Thanks so much.
Ethan.
Is there a weird echo going on? I'll try to fix that. You can explore more of Ian's fascinating past at his website, ianmillis.com, and his current activity at the Kandos School of Cultural Adaptation. I'd like to extend my appreciation to all the speakers on the panel for contributing to this presentation. Thanks to the organisers of the symposium and all the people that have contributed to making the event a success. The symposium is in association with the exhibition Panels that Transform at the Macquarie University Art Gallery, which will be open on November 12 for you to visit in person, which is exciting. So this exhibition will possibly also be touring Australia. So if you want to keep track of what's going on, just search everyone out on socials, and a recording of this panel will be up on, and I think the whole conference will be up on YouTube too, so you can share that around. And if you want to exchange any information or ask questions, feel free to keep the conversation going in the chat of the Facebook event pages. So thanks for joining us today, and see you on the streets.